There are two kinds of winter losses. The kind that makes sense. Mites, starvation, a queen that failed in September, and the kind that doesn't. The kind where you pull the cover in late February and find frames still heavy with honey. The cluster gone. Nothing left to explain it. No disease worth naming. No obvious cause. Just silence where 40,000 bees used to be. That second kind of loss is the one worth understanding. Because it keeps happening. To experienced beekeepers, not just beginners. And most of the time, the explanation never comes. Going back about 130 years helps. Not for nostalgia, because the beekeepers working New England in the 1880s and 1890s were losing fewer colonies in hard winters than many modern operations lose in mild ones. And the reason for that is almost entirely biological. If any of what gets covered here lines up with something you've seen in your own yard, it's worth leaving a note below. And if this kind of content is useful to you, it helps to subscribe. This channel moves slowly, but it stays focused on what actually matters in the hive. The bee cellar wasn't a primitive solution. That's the first thing to set aside. It wasn't something people did because they didn't know better. It was something people did because they understood, through decades of careful observation, what winter actually costs a colony. And they built a system around reducing that cost as far as possible. A working bee cellar in rural New England looked simple from the outside. Fieldstone construction, mostly, banked into a hillside or dug straight down, with a heavy door and a few inches of ventilation at the top and bottom. Dark inside, quiet, the kind of place that stays at the same temperature whether it's October or January, whether there's 2 feet of snow on the ground, or a January thaw running water off the eaves. The beekeeper who maintained it knew that temperature by feel. You walked down the stairs, and somewhere around the 3rd or 4th step, the air changed, cooler still. There was usually a smell, earth, old wood, and underneath it, the faint warm sweetness of bees in cluster. You could hear them before your eyes adjusted. A low hum, barely there, not the working sound of summer. Something quieter, something much older. Colonies went in before hard frost, late October into early November depending on the year. They came out in early March, when the first pollen sources were close enough to matter, and the old journals from that period, the ones kept by working beekeepers rather than hobbyists, describe something that stops making sense until the biology behind it does. Colonies coming out in March with more bees alive than operations that wintered above ground in the same county. Some accounts noted stores that had barely dropped. Most beekeepers have never heard of a bee cellar. Some would say that's progress. The bees might disagree. Here's what most people understand about winter bees. They cluster. They generate heat by vibrating their flight muscles. They maintain a core temperature around 95 degrees Fahrenheit regardless of what's happening outside. That part is well known. What gets less attention is the cost. Generating that heat requires fuel, honey, and the colder and more variable the outside temperature, the more fuel the cluster burns. That relationship between external temperature and internal consumption is the center of everything that follows. A colony sitting in a yard at 20 degrees Fahrenheit is burning stores to stay warm. A colony sitting in a yard that was 20 degrees at midnight and 42 degrees by 2 in the afternoon is burning considerably more, because the cluster responds to that warmth. Bees on the outside of the cluster loosen their formation. Some begin to move. In a warm enough midwinter afternoon, foragers may attempt flight and find nothing and return chilled or not return at all. The cluster that reassembles that evening is smaller, colder to start, and has consumed stores it wasn't supposed to touch until February. That warm January day most beekeepers see as a gift. It isn't. Do that 3 or 4 times across a single winter, and New England winters in the 1890s had plenty of freeze-thaw cycles, just as they do now. And the math changes. The colony that should have had ample stores into March finds itself short in February. The cluster compresses to conserve. Bees begin dying faster than they can be replaced. The population drops below the threshold needed to maintain cluster temperature, and the remaining bees starve surrounded by honey they can no longer reach. Frames full. Not a bee left alive. That's the second kind of winter loss. And it's been happening for as long as bees have been kept above ground in northern climates. The problem was never the cold. It never was. The problem was what happened between the cold. The cellar removed that variable almost entirely. 40 to 46 degrees, constant. No sunlight reaching the hive entrance. No warm afternoon to break the cluster formation. No freeze-thaw cycling to trigger foraging instinct at the wrong moment. The bees had no reason to move. No signal telling them spring had arrived. Nothing to respond to. They held cluster. They burned stores at the lowest possible rate. They waited. If this kind of historical beekeeping connects with what you've been seeing in your own hives, it helps to stay with the channel. There's more ground to cover on the old methods, and most of it has direct application to what happens in the yard today. Now here's where the biology lands hardest, and it took a while to fully appreciate it. A colony in stable 42-degree darkness doesn't just consume less honey. It enters a form of semi-dormancy that above-ground wintering rarely achieves. Bee metabolic rate drops to near its lowest functional level. Queens stop laying earlier and more completely. The winter bee population, those long-lived fat-bodied bees produced in late summer, holds longer, ages slower, and is in better physiological condition when spring arrives. The colony that comes out of the cellar in March isn't just surviving, it's preserved. That's why the old-timers saw what they saw. It wasn't luck. It wasn't regional. It was a system built around one biological fact. The less a winter colony is disturbed by temperature variation, the less it costs to keep it alive. And that's where the cellar changes everything. Not because it's warmer. Because it isn't. The method was well documented into the early 1900s. Agricultural journals carried detailed instructions, cellar dimensions, ventilation ratios, temperature management, timing. The datum publications referenced it. So did the early editions of what became standard beekeeping texts. And then, gradually, it disappeared. Not because it stopped working, because the industry moved toward standardized equipment, toward hive bodies designed for above-ground wintering, toward wrapping and insulating and ventilating as substitute strategies. The cellar required infrastructure, labor, and a particular kind of knowledge that didn't transfer easily through printed instructions. It required someone who had done it to show you how it felt. And that chain of transmission broke. There's something worth sitting with in that. A method that worked, genuinely, measurably worked, got set aside not because something better replaced it, but because something more convenient did. You don't need a cellar to use this. But you need to understand why it worked, because that biology doesn't change. The winter cluster in your hives right now, or the one you'll put together come October, responds to temperature variation the same way it did in 1890. The freeze-thaw problem is the same problem. The cost of a broken cluster is the same cost. What changes is what you do with that understanding. Location matters more than most people give it. A hive on the north side of a structure, shielded from afternoon sun, experiences less temperature variation than one sitting in an open south-facing yard. That difference, even a few degrees of swing reduced, a few fewer cluster-breaking afternoons across a winter, shows up in spring populations and in stores remaining at the end of February. Entrance reducers, properly used, serve part of the same function as the cellar door. They reduce the volume of cold air exchange and slow the intrusion of warm afternoon air. They're not the same thing, but the reasoning behind them is closer to the cellar than most people realize. Checking colonies through winter, the impulse to open the hive on a mild January day to see how they're doing, causes the exact disruption the cellar was designed to prevent. The old journals are consistent on this point. You went in, you carried colonies down, you closed the door, and you did not open it again until March. You listened at the door occasionally. You watched the entrance for dead bee accumulation, You did not disturb what was holding together in the dark. That restraint wasn't laziness. It was the most important part of the method. There's an emotional weight to that. If you've kept bees for any length of time, the instinct to check, to verify, to make sure, it's not a character flaw. It comes from caring about what's in those boxes. But winter beekeeping asks for a different kind of attention. Quiet attention, patient attention. The kind that trusts the biology to do what the biology has always done, as long as you don't give it reason to do otherwise. The beekeeper who walked down into the cellar in late March, when the maples were just starting to show red and the nights were still dropping below freezing, that moment had its own particular quality. The door opened. The smell of earth and beeswax came up first, and before he reached the bottom of the stairs, before his eyes found the hive boxes in the dim light, he heard it. That hum. Low. Building. Alive. 40,000 bees that had held through the cold, that had burned their stores carefully and held their cluster and waited without knowing they were waiting. Coming back. That sound, after a hard winter, is not a small thing. If you've opened hives in early spring and heard it, or if you've opened hives in early spring and found the silence instead, you know the difference in a way that doesn't require any explanation. There's a question worth sitting with as the season turns toward fall. Not how to replicate a bee cellar. Most operations can't and won't. But where your hives are positioned relative to afternoon sun, whether your entrance management is working with winter cluster biology or against it, whether your check-in timing through January and February is serving the bees or satisfying something else. The old-timers who built those cellars weren't smarter than modern beekeepers. They just couldn't afford to lose colonies the way we've learned to accept loss as normal. So they paid attention to what the biology was actually asking for. It might be worth asking what that looks like in your own yard, given what you now know. If any of this brought back a winter loss that never quite made sense, or changed how you're thinking about the coming season, it's worth leaving that in the comments. And if you found value in going this far back to understand what's happening in your hives right now, a like helps more people find it. There's more ground to cover. The old methods have more left to teach than most of us were told.